The Wives of Saddam Hussein. What happened after his execution, December 30th, 2006. 6:05 a.m., Baghdad. The trapdoor opens. Saddam Hussein falls. The dictator is dead. But two women, hidden in the shadows of exile, are about to discover that their nightmare has only just begun. These were the women who had shared his bed, borne his children, and lived inside one of history's most brutal regimes. What happened to them after the noose tightened would shock even those who thought they knew everything about the Hussein dynasty. For decades, Sajida Talfa and Samira Shabandar had lived lives of unimaginable luxury and terror in equal measure. They had walked the marble halls of presidential palaces, worn jewelry worth millions, commanded fear with a mere glance. But in the aftermath of their husband's execution, their golden cages would shatter in ways no one could have predicted. Before we can understand the devastating aftermath, we must first understand who these women were. Saddam Hussein's marital life was as complex and brutal as his political reign, marked by tradition, ambition, and calculated alliances that would ultimately seal their fates. Sajida Talfa wasn't just Saddam's wife. She was his first cousin, the daughter of his uncle and mentor, Khairallah Talfa. Their marriage in 1963 wasn't a love story. It was a political merger, a binding of bloodlines that would strengthen Saddam's grip on power. Born in 1937 in Tikrit, Sajida came from the same hardscrabble background as her husband, understanding the brutal mathematics of survival in Iraq's tribal society. From the beginning, Sajida was no passive figure. Those who knew her described a woman of fierce intelligence and even fiercer temper. She bore Saddam 5 children: Uday, Qusay, Raghad, Rana, and Hala. And for years, she was the undisputed First Lady of Iraq. Even as her husband's eye wandered, she understood power, wielded it when necessary, and by all accounts was one of the few people on earth who could challenge Saddam without immediately facing lethal consequences. But Sajida's position began to erode in the 1980s when Samira Shabandar entered the picture. Samira was everything Sajida was not: blonde, sophisticated, educated in the Western sense. She had been married to an Iraqi Airways executive when she caught Saddam's eye. The dictator, never one to be denied, arranged for her husband to be reassigned to a distant post, and took Samira as his second wife in 1986. Though the marriage remained largely secret for years, the contrast between the two women was stark. While Sajida represented the old Iraq, tribal, traditional, bound by blood, Samira embodied Saddam's aspirations for a modern image. She was his public relations project, accompanying him to events where Sajida's rough edges might show. But this created a powder keg within the presidential palaces, a rivalry that would have deadly consequences. The tension exploded in 1995 when Saddam's son, Uday, Sajida's firstborn and the apple of her eye, committed an act that would forever alter the family dynamics. At a party in full view of guests, Uday murdered Kamal Hana Gegeo, Saddam's personal valet and the man who had introduced Samira to the dictator. The killing was Uday's twisted way of defending his mother's honor, but it backfired spectacularly. Saddam was furious, reportedly beating his son with a cane and imprisoning him. Sajida, caught between her husband's rage and her maternal instincts, made a choice that would define her remaining years in Iraq. She sided with her son. The family never recovered from this schism. Sajida retreated to her own compound, rarely appearing in public, while Samira's star continued to rise. But both women, despite their rivalry, shared one common trait. They were survivors in a world where a wrong word could mean death. As the 1990s progressed and international sanctions strangled Iraq, both women watched their golden world slowly tarnish. They witnessed the growing paranoia of their husband, the increasing isolation of their country, and the brewing storm that would eventually sweep them all away. But nothing could have prepared them for what was coming next. March 20th, 2003 marked the beginning of the end. As American bombs rained down on Baghdad in the opening salvos of shock and awe, Sajida and Samira found themselves in different corners of the crumbling empire, their fates already diverging in those crucial first hours. Sajida, by then largely estranged from Saddam, had been living in a separate compound with her daughters Raghad and Rana. Intelligence reports from that time paint a picture of a woman who sensed the end was near. In the weeks before the invasion, she had quietly begun moving assets, burning documents, and preparing for the worst. Her years of watching Saddam's brutal statecraft had taught her one crucial lesson. In Iraq, regime change meant blood would flow, and the blood of the dictator's family would flow first. On April 9, 2003, as American tanks rolled into Baghdad and the world watched Saddam's statue topple in Firdos Square, Sajida was already gone. She had fled with her daughters days earlier, slipping across the border into Jordan under cover of darkness. The speed and secrecy of her escape suggested long preparation. This was no panicked flight, but a carefully orchestrated extraction. Samira's escape was equally dramatic, but took a different route. As Saddam's favorite, she had remained closer to him until nearly the end. Reports from Iraqi intelligence officials who later cooperated with coalition forces described seeing her at various safe houses with Saddam in the early days of the invasion. But as the noose tightened and Saddam went fully underground, Samira too vanished. She reportedly fled to Lebanon first, carrying with her millions in cash and jewelry. Unlike Sajida, who had family connections in Jordan, Samira had to rely on money and the network of Lebanese businessmen who had profited from Iraq's oil for food program. She moved like a ghost through Beirut's banking district, converting assets, destroying trails, trying to build a new life from the ashes of the old. The contrast in their escapes reflected their different positions in Saddam's life. Sajida, the tribal wife, fled to family. Samira, the modern mistress, fled to money. Both strategies would be tested in the years to come. Meanwhile, back in Iraq, the hunt for Saddam intensified. For 8 months, he evaded capture, moving between safe houses, protected by a shrinking circle of loyalists. During this time, both wives maintained absolute silence. There were no public statements, no appeals for mercy, no attempts to negotiate. They knew that in the new Iraq, association with Saddam was a death sentence. On December 13, 2003, Operation Red Dawn concluded with Saddam's capture in an underground hole near Tikrit. The image of the once mighty dictator, bearded and disheveled, being examined by American medics, was broadcast around the world. In Jordan and Lebanon, 2 women watched these images with emotions we can only imagine. The man who had defined their lives for decades, reduced to a prisoner, but their ordeal was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The capture of Saddam triggered a series of events that would test both women in ways they never anticipated. The period between Saddam's capture in 2003 and his execution in 2006 was perhaps the most precarious time in both women's lives. They were neither fully free nor fully captive, existing in a twilight zone of international law and regional politics. Sajida had fled to Jordan with her daughters Raghad and Rana, and initially they were received as guests of the Jordanian royal family. King Abdullah II, walking a delicate tightrope between Western allies and Arab public opinion, granted them sanctuary on humanitarian grounds. But this came with strict conditions. No political activities, no public statements, and absolutely no contact with Iraqi resistance groups. The Jordanian government assigned them a modest villa in Amman's affluent Abdoun district, a far cry from the palaces of Baghdad, but comfortable enough. Yet comfort was relative. Sajida found herself under constant surveillance. Jordanian intelligence officers monitored her every move. Her phone calls were recorded. Visitors were thoroughly vetted. She was free to move within Jordan, but couldn't leave without permission. A golden cage of a different sort. Financial pressure mounted quickly. The millions that Sajida had managed to smuggle out began to dwindle. Legal fees for Saddam's trial, supporting her daughters and grandchildren, and maintaining even a modest lifestyle in expensive Amman ate through her resources. Reports from this period describe her selling jewelry piece by piece, each sale a small surrender of her former life. Her daughters, Raghad and Rana, faced their own struggles. Both had been married to the Camel brothers, who had defected to Jordan in 1995, only to make the fatal mistake of returning to Iraq, where Saddam had them executed. Now widows in exile, they had to raise their children while dealing with the trauma of their past and the uncertainty of their future. Raghad, in particular, struggled with the restrictions. She was more politically minded than her sister and chafed at the enforced silence. The situation exploded in July 2006 when Jordanian authorities discovered that Raghad had been in contact with Iraqi insurgent groups, allegedly trying to fund operations against the new Iraqi government. Whether this was true or a convenient excuse for Jordan to distance itself from the increasingly toxic Hussein family remains debated. What's certain is that it put enormous pressure on Sajida, who had to watch her daughter become a wanted woman while being powerless to help. Samira's situation in Lebanon was equally precarious, but different in character. Lebanon, with its weak central government and complex sectarian politics, couldn't offer the same structured sanctuary that Jordan provided. Instead, Samira had to rely on a network of fixers, lawyers, and businessmen, each taking their cut of her dwindling fortune. She moved frequently, never staying in one place for more than a few months. Beirut, Sidon, Tripoli. She ghosted through Lebanon cities, always one step ahead of both Iraqi agents seeking revenge and international investigators tracking Saddam's hidden assets. The woman who had once commanded attention now worked desperately to remain invisible. The financial investigation was particularly threatening to Samira. As Saddam's second wife, she had been more involved in his international financial dealings: Swiss banks, Austrian real estate, French companies. Investigators followed a complex web of transactions, many leading back to accounts she had helped establish. Every frozen asset, every seized property represented not just lost wealth, but increased vulnerability. Both women watched from afar as Saddam's trial unfolded. The proceedings, broadcast across the Arab world, were a surreal spectacle. The man who had ruled through fear now stood in a dock, arguing with judges, disrupting proceedings, still trying to command authority, even as his world collapsed around him. Neither Sajida nor Samira made any public comment during the trial, maintaining their silence even as Saddam was sentenced to death on November 5, 2006. But behind closed doors, both women knew what was coming. The execution was inevitable, and with it would come a new phase of their ordeal. They would no longer be the wives of a captured dictator, but the widows of an executed one. In the Middle East's harsh political arithmetic, this change in status would bring new dangers and new vulnerabilities. The pre-dawn hours of December 30th, 2006 changed everything. As Saddam Hussein walked to the gallows, taunted by his executioners in his final moments, two women in different countries waited for news that would irrevocably alter their lives. The execution, filmed on a mobile phone and leaked to the world, showed not just the death of a dictator, but the final severing of the threads that had bound these women to power. In Amman, Sajida received the news in her villa, surrounded by her daughters. Witnesses later described a scene of controlled grief. There were no wailing demonstrations of sorrow, no dramatic collapses. Sajida, then 69 years old, simply sat in silence for hours, occasionally murmuring prayers. Her response was shaped by decades of living with violence. She had learned long ago that in their world, public displays of emotion were luxuries that could cost lives. But beneath this stoic exterior, the execution triggered an immediate crisis. Under Islamic law and Iraqi tribal custom, Sajida, as the first wife, had certain rights regarding Saddam's body and burial. The Iraqi government, however, had no intention of allowing the executed dictator's remains to become a rallying point for insurgents. They buried him quickly and secretly in his birthplace of Al-Auja near Tikrit, without allowing his family to attend. This denial of basic funeral rites cut deeply. In Arab culture, proper burial is not just a religious obligation, but a fundamental human dignity. Sajida's inability to fulfill this duty as a wife added a layer of humiliation to her grief. She attempted to work through intermediaries, even reaching out to Iraqi government officials through Jordanian channels, but was rebuffed at every turn. The execution also triggered a dangerous shift in how both women were perceived. While Saddam lived, even in captivity, they retained a certain untouchable quality. They were connected to a living former head of state, however reviled. Now they were simply the relatives of an executed war criminal. The thin protection this status had afforded them began to evaporate. For Samira in Lebanon, the execution brought immediate danger. Within days, she received death threats. Iraqi Shia groups, empowered by Saddam's death, openly called for revenge against all members of his family. Lebanese authorities, already uncomfortable with her presence, made it clear she was no longer welcome. She had weeks, perhaps days, to find another sanctuary. Her flight from Lebanon was harrowing. Using false documents and traveling by car to avoid airport security, she made her way to Syria. This was late 2006, before Syria's own descent into civil war, when Assad's regime still provided haven for former Iraqi Baathists. But even there, safety was relative. She lived under an assumed name, rarely venturing out, dependent on the protection of a government that could withdraw its support at any moment. Back in Jordan, Sajida faced a different but equally challenging situation. The execution had emboldened the Iraqi government to formally request the extradition of all Hussein family members. They wanted Sajida and her daughters to stand trial, not necessarily for specific crimes, but as symbols of the old regime. Jordan refused, citing humanitarian grounds, but the pressure was intense. King Abdullah faced a delicate balance. Public opinion in Jordan, where many Palestinians and Iraqis sympathized with Saddam as a symbol of Arab resistance, opposed extradition. But Jordan's Western allies and Gulf neighbors wanted the Hussein family problem to disappear. The compromise was to make their lives increasingly restricted and uncomfortable, hoping they would leave voluntarily. Sajida's movements became even more limited. Her Jordanian residency was made temporary, requiring renewal every few months, each renewal a bureaucratic humiliation. Her access to her remaining funds was restricted. Most painfully, several of her grandchildren were denied permission to visit, effectively separating her from the next generation. The psychological toll was immense. Both women had spent decades as part of Iraq's ruling elite, their every whim catered to, their every word carrying the weight of life and death. Now they were supplicants, dependent on the mercy of governments that viewed them as embarrassing relics. The transition from power to powerlessness was absolute and crushing, but perhaps the cruelest blow came from within their own family. The execution exposed long-simmering divisions among Saddam's children and relatives. Some family members publicly distanced themselves from Sajida and Samira, hoping to build new lives free from the Hussein legacy. Others blamed the wives for not doing more to save Saddam or preserve the family's wealth. The family that had once ruled through unity now turned on itself in exile. As 2007 dawned, both women settled into a grim new reality. The immediate crisis of Saddam's execution had passed, but in its place came the grinding challenge of long-term exile, each year bringing new pressures, new humiliations, and new reminders of how far they had fallen. Sajida's situation in Jordan deteriorated steadily. In 2007, the Iraqi government placed her on their most wanted list, offering a reward for information leading to her capture. Though Jordan refused extradition, this designation made her toxic to anyone who might help her. Banks became reluctant to handle her accounts. Lawyers thought twice before taking her calls. Even shops in Amman's affluent districts, where she had once spent freely, now viewed her as a liability. The financial pressure was relentless. The modest stipend the Jordanian government initially provided was cut, then cut again. By 2008, reports emerged of Sajida selling her last pieces of significant jewelry. including a diamond necklace that had once belonged to Kuwait's royal family, looted during the 1990 invasion. Each sale was negotiated in secret, the buyers knowing her desperation and offering pennies on the dollar. Her health began to fail. The stress of exile, combined with age and the loss of access to the elite medical care she had once enjoyed, took its toll. She developed diabetes, complicated by depression that she refused to acknowledge or treat. In a culture where mental health issues carry stigma, Sajida maintained her facade of strength, even as she crumbled internally. Her daughters faced their own struggles. Ragad, placed on Interpol's wanted list in 2007 for allegedly funding terrorism, became virtually imprisoned in Jordan. She couldn't travel, couldn't work legally, and lived in constant fear of assassination. Iraqi intelligence services made it clear that they considered her a legitimate target. Several attempts on her life were reported, though the details remain murky. Rana, the younger daughter, tried to maintain a lower profile, but faced her own challenges. Her children, Saddam's grandchildren, grew up stateless, denied Iraqi citizenship by the new government, and unable to obtain Jordanian nationality. They attended private schools under assumed names, their classmates unaware they were sitting next to the grandchildren of one of history's most notorious dictators. The family's isolation deepened when, in 2008, Jordan officially closed the Iraqi embassy section that had been handling their affairs. This seemingly bureaucratic move had profound implications. They no longer had any official channel to communicate with Iraq, to handle property claims, or to resolve legal issues. They were effectively non-persons, existing in a legal limbo. Samira's trajectory in Syria was different, but equally tragic. Initially, she found a degree of safety in Damascus, protected by Assad's regime, which maintained ties with former Baathists as a hedge against the new Iraqi government. She lived in a modest apartment in the Metzeh district, an area favored by security officials where surveillance was constant, but so was protection. For a brief period, roughly 2007 to 2010, Samira achieved something approaching stability. She had managed to salvage enough money to live comfortably, if not luxuriously. She avoided politics, maintained no contact with Iraqi opposition groups, and gradually faded from public consciousness. Some reports from this period describe her taking up painting, returning to an interest from her youth, creating abstract works that she never showed to anyone. But this fragile peace was shattered by the Arab Spring. As protests erupted in Syria in 2011 and the country descended into civil war, Samira's protected status evaporated. The Assad regime, fighting for its survival, could no longer guarantee the safety of Iraqi exiles. The Metzeh district where she lived became a battleground between government forces and rebels. Samira was forced to flee again, this time with almost nothing. The woman who had once traveled in private jets now joined the streams of refugees heading for the Turkish border. But unlike anonymous refugees who could disappear into camps, Samira's identity made her a target for multiple groups. Iraqi agents, Syrian rebels who saw her as a regime collaborator, and Islamic extremists who viewed her as a symbol of secular dictatorship. She reportedly spent months moving between safe houses in northern Syria, protected by a shrinking network of former Baathists who themselves were being hunted. Money that might have bought her passage to safety went instead to bribes for protection. By 2012, reports placed her in Turkey, though the Turkish government never officially acknowledged her presence. The Syrian civil war also affected Sajida in Jordan. The massive influx of Syrian refugees strained Jordan's resources and patience. The government, dealing with a humanitarian crisis, had even less tolerance for the Hussein family. Pressure mounted for them to leave. But where could they go? No country wanted to accept the widow of Saddam Hussein. By 2013, both women had been in exile for a full decade. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a grinding desperation. They had sold everything of value, exhausted most of their connections, and watched as the world moved on from the Iraq War. They were relics of a bygone era, forgotten by all except those who still sought revenge. While Sajida and Samira faced their own struggles, a parallel tragedy unfolded: the destruction of the next generation. Saddam's grandchildren, innocent of their grandfather's crimes, inherited the full weight of his legacy. In Jordan, Sajida watched helplessly as her grandchildren grew up marked by their bloodline. One grandson, Ali, Uday's son, excelled academically under an assumed name. But when he applied to university in 2010, his true identity was discovered. Not only was his application rejected, but he was expelled from high school. The grandfather's sins had become the grandson's curse. The younger grandchildren, born in exile, existed in stateless limbo, Jordanian in culture but denied nationality, Iraqi by blood but banned from the country. Some attempted to escape the Hussein legacy by changing names and moving countries. But in the age of facial recognition and global databases, true anonymity proved impossible. The psychological toll was severe. Many required therapy for depression and anxiety, though their status complicated access to care. They lived in constant fear. Every knock on the door, every official letter could be a threat. Sajida could offer them nothing but stories of a grander past, which only emphasized their fall. The situation exploded in 2014 with ISIS's rise. The extremist group made overtures to the Hussein family, hoping to leverage Saddam's legacy among former Baathists. This put the family in an impossible position. Any association would mean expulsion from Jordan, but refusal could invite the group's vengeance. The mere possibility of such connections intensified surveillance and restriction. By 2015, the damage was evident. Several grandchildren had developed substance abuse problems. Education and employment became impossible as universities and companies faced social media campaigns if they accepted anyone connected to Saddam. For the girls, even marriage was complicated. Potential suitors' families rejected the Hussein name, while those willing often sought imagined hidden wealth that didn't exist. As the 2010s progressed, time ran out for both women. Age, illness, and exile's grinding toll pushed them toward their final act. Sajida's health collapsed after 2015. Diabetes worsened, complicated by heart problems and untreated depression. By 2016, she was confined to the villa in Amman. Her world shrunk to a few rooms. The family survived on loans from the few friends still willing to risk association. The humiliation of dependency for a woman who once commanded millions deepened her suffering. In her only interview during these years, speaking through intermediaries, Sajida revealed nothing of remorse. She spoke only of family, duty, and the injustice of her situation. Even facing death, she wouldn't break from the narrative that defined her life. Samira's final years were even more obscure. After fleeing Syria, she vanished. Intelligence reports placed her in Turkey, Qatar, perhaps Russia. Nothing confirmed. Unlike Sajida, who had her daughters, Samira was entirely alone. She had no children with Saddam, and her birth family had long distanced themselves. Those who claimed to have seen her described a woman destroyed. The blonde hair that had caught Saddam's eye had gone gray, the fashionable clothes replaced by anonymous dress. She spoke to no one, trusted no one, waiting for an end to a life that had taken unimaginable turn. The myth of hidden wealth haunted both women. Con artists and treasure hunters approached regularly, convinced they sat on secret fortunes. The reality, near destitution, seemed impossible. This mythology made their poverty dangerous. Criminal groups attempted several kidnappings for ransom, each foiled plot reminding them they'd never be free from Saddam's shadow. By 2020, both women were in their 80s, health failing, resources exhausted. The COVID-19 pandemic added final isolation. Jordan's lockdowns restricted Sajida's already limited movement. For Samira, wherever she was, global travel restrictions made her precarious situation worse. They existed in twilight, waiting for an inevitable end. The end came as anticlimactically as it was inevitable. Both women died as they had lived their final years, in exile, forgotten by a world that had moved on. Samira went first, though exact circumstances remain mysterious. Reports emerged in 2020 of her death, possibly in Turkey, but no official confirmation came. No funeral announcement, no obituary. She simply ceased to exist, erased as thoroughly in death as she had tried to erase herself in life. Those claiming knowledge of her final days described her dying alone, possibly in a hospital under an assumed name, with no family present. Her body was reportedly buried in an unmarked grave, location known only to officials who handled arrangements. Even in death, she was too politically radioactive to handle openly. Sajida died in 2021. Details equally scarce. No government officially announced her death. Iraqi media reported it, citing family sources but couldn't agree on exact dates or circumstances. She died in the same modest villa where she'd spent 2 decades in exile, far from Baghdad's palaces, far from Saddam's grave in Tikrit. In Iraq, no celebrations like with Saddam's execution, but no sympathy either. They had become footnotes, their deaths administrative matters handled discreetly. Among expatriates, reactions were mixed. Some mourned them as links to a lost era. Others saw their suffering as insufficient justice. Most had simply moved on. The international community largely ignored their passing. Major news outlets gave brief mention, if any. The women, once tracked by satellites and pursued by investigators, died without anyone particularly noticing. Their deaths marked an era's end. With them died the last direct links to Saddam's inner circle, whatever secrets they held about hidden assets and the regime's workings. But perhaps most tragic was what happened to the family afterward. Children and grandchildren were left more vulnerable without even the minimal protection the widow's presence had provided. Even after their deaths, the story continues. The Hussein family's 3rd generation still pays for the sins of the first. The curse proving genuinely generational. Raghad and Rana, Sajida's daughters, remain in Jordan, their situation increasingly precarious. Both in their 50s, their entire adult lives have been spent in exile. They've watched their children grow stateless, opportunities vanish, living under constant surveillance. Raghad's attempts to rehabilitate the family name through interviews portraying her father as misunderstood have only increased their isolation. Her inclusion on wanted lists means she can never leave Jordan. The grandchildren's attempts at normal lives have met mixed success. Some immigrated to where the Hussein name carries less weight, Yemen, Sudan, but live in constant fear of discovery. Others remain trapped in Jordan, unable to work legally, unable to travel, existing in legal limbo. Their children, Saddam's great-grandchildren, are born into the same stateless existence, the curse extending to a 4th generation with no memory of Iraq, but unable to escape its shadow. Financial desperation continues. Whatever hidden wealth Saddam accumulated has been seized or remains effectively lost. The family survives on charity from remaining sympathizers and informal work. International human rights organizations occasionally raise concerns about stateless children punished for crimes they didn't commit. But Iraqi and Jordanian authorities dismiss these, arguing the family isn't actively persecuted, merely denied privileges. Psychological studies reveal deep trauma across generations, PTSD in adults, inherited trauma in children who've never known stability or safety. Several family members attempted selling memoirs, but publishers remain wary. The few published met anger from victims and reinforced isolation. The Iraqi government shows no signs of softening. As long as politicians gain votes by being tough on the Hussein family, as long as victims demand justice, the descendants remain pariahs. Meanwhile, Sajida and Samira's graves remain unmarked, unvisited. No family can safely pay respects. They lie in foreign soil, burial sites secret even from their children. The complete destruction of Saddam's family serves as history's warning about absolute power's ultimate price. Not just the dictator pays, but generations become collateral damage in history's judgment. The story of Sajida Talfa and Samira Shahbandar is ultimately a tragedy of an entire system that elevated them impossibly high, then destroyed them utterly. Marrying Saddam, remaining through decades of brutality, benefiting from a regime built on fear. Whether they had real alternatives in Saddam's Iraq, where opposition meant death, remains debatable. But they paid an unimaginable price. They lost everything: wealth, status, country, freedom. And finally, their lives in lonely exile. They watched their children suffer. Grandchildren grow up stateless. They died far from home, graves unmarked, stories untold, except as footnotes to their husband's monstrous legacy. Their case raises uncomfortable questions about collective punishment and inherited guilt. While Sajida and Samira's complicity in Saddam's regime may warrant little sympathy, what about grandchildren born in exile who never knew Iraq, never benefited from Saddam's rule, but carry his curse? Where does accountability end and collective punishment begin? The story serves as a stark warning about power's impermanence. Palaces where they lived are destroyed or repurposed, wealth seized or lost, fear they commanded transformed into fear they lived with daily. For those under current dictatorships, the Hussein wives' fate previews potential futures. Luxuries, protection, wealth accumulated through corruption can vanish overnight when regimes fall. The deaths of Sajida and Samira marked the effective end of the Hussein dynasty. Descendants survive as shadows, their name a burden, not a blessing. The family that ruled Iraq with an iron fist has scattered, their story a testament to tyranny's ultimate futility. Both women died as they lived their final years, quietly, secretly, forgotten. Complex, tragic stories reduced to footnotes, cautionary tales about proximity to power. They were dictators' wives, mothers to murdered sons, grandmothers to stateless children. Ultimately, casualties of history they helped write but couldn't escape. All that remains are unmarked graves and descendants carrying an unspeakable name. This was their brutal fate after Saddam's execution. Not dramatic endings, but slow destruction. Not martyrdom, but marginalization. Not even the dignity of being remembered as individuals, rather than extensions of their infamous husband. Their fate stands as history's harsh warning. Those who rise through violence and oppression will fall into darkness and disgrace. And they will not fall alone. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss more compelling and untold stories from history.